Topic 4.6 focuses on watersheds. And the definition of a watershed, it's basically an area of land in which snow and rain and precipitation all eventually lead to streams or a river or an ocean to an outflow. And we'll look at some maps that show watersheds. But if we think about the subsurface water, there's something that we call groundwater. Groundwater is an area beneath the surface that is saturated with water. It can be in soil. It can also be in the rock that has pores, which can contain that water. So if we look at this model on the top, what we see is obviously a forest and the surface of the land. And then there's an area below the surface where you have unsaturated. This is the unsaturated zone. It may contain some water, but it's not fully saturated. And then they have this line here that's what's called the water table. This is the boundary. Below the water table, the ground or the rock is saturated with water, and above the water table, it's not. And so this groundwater is extremely important, especially to humans, because this groundwater is what we use for clean water, for drinking water. We can withdraw water from the ground using wells, and we can extract that water and use it. And that water, that groundwater, it can be recharged over time through the action of precipitation and infiltration. When water seeps in through this unsaturated zone into the saturated zone, that can recharge the groundwater. And when we think about groundwater, we often will refer to what's called an aquifer. An aquifer is an area of groundwater, and humans often access this water in aquifers. Okay? So we can see this model shows some aquifers, different types of aquifers, and how humans get to that water. What we have here is an unconfined aquifer. Doesn't have a layer containing it. This is basically the water table that we see at this upper surface, and below that is the groundwater. And we can use a well that is dug. A well is basically just a hole into the ground that accesses groundwater. And we can have pumps, okay, generally electric pumps, that can pump that water from the water table into homes and businesses, etc. So that's one way of accessing this groundwater, through using a well. There's other types of groundwater, other types of aquifer that are contained. There may be a layer of clay, for example, that's confining this aquifer that's below it. It's a confining layer. It's a layer that's impermeable to water. And so we can also dig a well into these confined aquifers. This is called an artesian well. And sometimes if that water is under pressure, then the water actually can flow out of the top of that well without a pump. That's a flowing artesian well. We often will call these springs, where we have springs which are bringing the subsurface water to the surface without any mechanical means. And so humans access this water. If you live out in the country where you're not connected to a municipal water supply, like in more urban and suburban areas, you may have at your house a well. It's basically a hole into the ground dug so that you can access fresh water from this groundwater. In other areas, like in the city or in suburbs that are connected to municipal water, the water might come from surface, like the water in Utica comes from the Hinckley Reservoir, where water flows from the Hinckley Reservoir into the municipal water supply that supplies Utica and its surroundings. When we think about this term watershed, a watershed basically is all of the land in a given area that drains to one particular stream or river or lake or wetland or ocean. So, for example, most of us probably live in the watershed that's called the Sequoia Creek watershed. Okay, if we look at this map here, okay, here's the city of Utica, here's the village of New Hartford, the town of New Hartford, okay, we're right around over here. But basically this blue line outlines the Sequoia Creek watershed. This is the Sequoia Creek. Bends flows right past our school, underneath Genesee Street, eventually into Whitesboro. But that's the Sequoia Creek. And basically, any water that falls inside of this boundary eventually will make its way to the Sequoia Creek and be transferred from the Sequoia Creek through to another body of water, which we'll talk about here in a minute. So watersheds have, a certain amount of land area. They have a certain length. The slope and topography of the land influences the movement of water through the watershed. The vegetation influences it. But what's important to understand about a watershed is that basically any activity within this watershed, say the use of pesticides or fertilizers, can eventually make its way into the Sequoia Creek and further on as it drains. And so to understand watersheds, we have to understand watersheds is important to understanding land use and how it might affect water quality. And so here we have a larger map. Watersheds can be found in different scales. So we looked at a relatively small watershed, the Sequoia Creek watershed. But the Sequoia Creek is part of a larger watershed that we see outlined here. Okay. This is what's called the Mohawk River watershed. We can see the Mohawk River, which flows pretty much along the thruway. That's the Mohawk River watershed. So again, the Sequoia Creek watershed, which we find here, is a part of this larger Mohawk River watershed. And the Mohawk River watershed, if we look at this map on the right, is a part of an even larger watershed, the Hudson River watershed. All of the water in this colored area eventually makes its way into the Hudson River, which eventually makes its way into the Atlantic Ocean down around New York City. And so we have the Sequoia watershed is a small area here. The Mohawk watershed is larger, and then the Hudson River watershed is even larger than that. And we can see other major watersheds found throughout the United States. We can see the Mississippi watershed here and other watersheds, which are really important. And this video shows just sort of how expansive a watershed can be. This is tracing the path of all of the Mississippi River watershed. And all of these tributaries and streams and rivers eventually make their way to the Mississippi, which eventually makes its way into the Gulf of Mexico. So you can see what a wide geographic area this is that makes up this Mississippi River watershed.